The war in Israel is said to be a fight over land, and specifically for Palestinians to take their land back and be relieved of Israel occupying Palestinian territory. But others are saying that that's not true at all. With so many conflicting narratives and facts, what is the truth? Today, we're going to talk about the facts that no one seems to want to talk about. Let's get into it. Today, I'm joined by Robert Spencer, the author of the book, The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of Middle East Peace Process. And today we're going to go ahead and get his thoughts on an opposing position pumped forth by the commentator Mark Lamont Hill. Now, with so many opposing views going on over the last few days, it's hard to know what we should believe when it comes to the alleged facts surrounding who's the rightful owner of the land in Palestine. Now, Robert, you have your position, of course, but before this interview started, I told you that I want for us to try to be as objective as possible and to just give the facts. So let's go ahead and watch this video by Mark Hill together, and we'll get your input along the way.
Okay. As we discuss the events that have taken place in Israel and in Gaza over this past weekend, we have to be able to do several things at once. For me, that starts with sending sincere sympathy and condolences to all of the innocent men, women, and children who were killed in the violence that took place in Israel and Palestine over the past weekend. Targeting civilians is a violation of international law. It's a violation of religious law. It is a violation of basic human decency. It must be condemned without excuse. It must be condemned without reservation. Full stop. But we cannot begin or end our analysis with what happened this past weekend. Long before Hamas ever sent a rocket, or even before Hamas was formed, Palestinians have lived under Israeli occupation. Israel control of Gaza, which continues even after the departure of Israeli citizens in 2005, has transformed Gaza into an open-air prison. The conditions in Gaza are literally unlivable and have only gotten worse in recent days. The people of Gaza have consistently lived under military siege, daily violence, and collective punishment. The broader Palestinian community has lived under oppressive military occupation, which has subjected them to dehumanizing conditions within an apartheid state.
Hey, what are your thoughts on that?
There's so many inaccuracies in that. I hope we have time to cover them all. But the first thing is occupation. Gaza is not occupied. It's not occupied physically. There were Israelis there, but they all left in 2005. And the whole idea of their leaving was to bring about peace by ending any occupation. And so there has been no Israeli presence there since 2005. Now, Mark Lamont Hill says, nonetheless, even after they left, they have been oppressing the Palestinians, and it's an open-air prison. Now, why is it difficult for Palestinians to pass from Gaza into Israel? Because many of them, when they get into Israel, have started killing people. Now, unfortunately, when you don't know who's going to kill people and who isn't, you have to have checkpoints and search the people who are trying to come in. That is what the open-air prison is all about, that he's talking about. It's also interesting to note that Egypt has a border with Gaza, and Egypt just closed it. Is Egypt an apartheid state that hates Muslims? Egypt is just concerned about its national security. And Egypt knows, as well as Israel knows, that Gaza is full of jihadis. And they don't want them in Egypt any more than they want them in Israel. And so the fact that the border is closed does not make it an open-air prison. It makes it a recognition of the reality of jihad activity in Gaza. Also, from a legal standpoint, occupied territory suggests that somebody else owns the land. Who owns Gaza? Now, if you ask Mark Lamont Hill, I imagine that he would say the Palestinians. It ought to be a Palestinian state, and the West Bank as well. Now, and actually, since he got fired from CNN for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine would be free, he probably thinks that all of Israel is occupied territory. But there was never a Palestinian state. There was never a Palestinian kingdom, republic, empire, anything you want to name. There was never a political entity that was Palestine. And then people sometimes have said, when I say this, wait a minute, in the 1939 World Book Encyclopedia, there's a flag of Palestine. Yeah, but it's a Star of David. And that's 9 years before the founding of the State of Israel. Palestine was the name of a region. It was the name given to Judea, which means land of the Jews. by the Romans in 134 AD when they expelled the Jews from the area. Many of the Jews didn't leave, and there has always been a Jewish presence in the land. But the last owner of the land was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire fell shortly after World War I. Before it fell, just as it was falling, the Ottoman Empire actually ceded legal authority over that land, Gaza and the rest of Israel and the Holy Land, the whole thing, the West Bank, the whole thing, to the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. The League of Nations gave it to Britain as part of what was called the Mandate for Palestine. The Mandate for Palestine was a specific directive to the British to create a Jewish national home in this land. What was the land that was set aside for the Jewish national home? All of what is today Jordan and all of what is today Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. The British immediately gave the whole eastern part to the Arabs, and that's Jordan. But they set aside the rest for the Jewish national home. So what does that mean? Israel is the Jewish national home. The only country in the world that actually has a legal claim to the land of Gaza is Israel. Now, Egypt occupied Gaza from 1948 to 1967, and that's another interesting thing. You didn't hear a word about occupation then, and that's because this is really a religious conflict, and it's all about hating Jews and all about not wanting to recognize Jewish authority over Muslims, because the Muslims, as Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, said, Islam must dominate and not be dominated. And so they didn't mind when Egypt was occupying, and nobody talked about occupied territory, even though that was an actual occupation. Nobody minded, and nobody talked about Palestinian rights. The Palestinians, as a matter of fact, are not mentioned in the history of the world until the 1960s. There were no Palestinians. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, they were the Arabs of the local area. The Palestinian nationality was created in the 1960s as a rhetorical weapon against Israel. And it's worked very well. But the fact is, the non-anger of Egypt while Gaza was under its occupation for 19 years is an indication that this is really all about Islam and the Jews. And the Egypt being Muslim, there was no problem about occupation while Egypt was in Gaza.
Okay, interesting take. Okay, let's hear what he says next.
Even when the world isn't watching, especially when the world isn't watching, Palestinian villages are bombed, homes are demolished or taken, journalists are killed, protesters are executed. Under these conditions of ethnic cleansing, international law, human nature, and just basic common sense all suggest that resistance is both reasonable and necessary. Now, that said, violent resistance has never been the first step. Palestinians have always made efforts toward nonviolent solutions. Every Palestinian attempt, though, at nonviolent resistance, from peaceful protests to BDS to literature festivals, they've all been met with criminalization, violence, or public smearing campaigns. Even when Hamas hasn't recognized Israel, and that's true, other groups like the PLO and Fatah have absolutely done so. And still, Israel has refused to engage in reasonable, good faith negotiations. And more recently, they have refused to negotiate with Palestinians at all.
This makes me wonder if Mark Lamont Hill has any knowledge of the history of the last 100 years. This is really an appalling level of twisting of the historical facts. In 1947, the United Nations offered to partition what was left of the Mandate for Palestine, which was supposed to be for the Jewish national home, and create a Jewish state and an Arab state, yet another Arab state. There were already 22 Arab countries, but that was not good enough. They had to have 23. And yet they rejected that. The Jews said, yeah, sure, we'll take that. And they took the little bit, the sliver of the original mandate that was left, and they made Israel there. The Arabs rejected a Palestinian state in 1948. Then in 1967, the offer was made again after the Six-Day War. In the 70s, at the Camp David Accords. In the 90s, at the Oslo Accords. In the 2000s, there was an offer made by the Prime Minister of Israel for everything that the Palestinians were demanding. It was like 99% of the territorial demands they were making, plus extra for the 1%. They were the prime minister offered them compensation in other areas for the 1% that he didn't want to give. They rejected that. The idea that the Palestinians have wanted to make peace and the Israelis have rejected it is completely ahistorical. It's just the other way around. And when it comes to nonviolent initiatives, the idea that the Israelis have crushed nonviolent initiatives and are oppressing the Palestinians is likewise completely false. The fact is that when he brushes by it real quick, he says, Hamas, yes, has not recognized Israel, but Fatah has, and the others have. Fatah has never recognized Israel as a Jewish state. It's recognized the existence of the state of Israel, but left open the possibility of it being overwhelmed by Arab Muslims who would transform it into an Islamic state. Has never recognized the right of a Jewish state to exist on that land. And Hamas just wants to destroy it utterly. Fatah does too, really, if you read between the lines. So the idea of Israel being able to live with that, it seems to me to be ridiculous. It's made the completely reasonable request that if we're going to make a framework for peace that's supposed to be a two-state solution in which we coexist peacefully with one another, then you have to recognize that we have a right to exist and be here. Otherwise, it's just a hollow assurance, and ultimately you're going to use the new state the way Gaza has been used as a new jihad base to launch attacks against Israel. And that's the other thing he says, that Gaza keeps getting bombed and buildings blown up and so on. This is not some gratuitous action that happens out of the blue while the Gazans are picking daisies and singing folk songs, and then suddenly the Israelis bomb the place. This is a reaction to the fact that Gaza keeps sending rockets aimed at Israeli civilians and keeps, and the rhetoric, the hair-raising genocidal rhetoric that has been recognized in Palestinian textbooks again and again and again. Children of the youngest ages are taught to hate Jews, to want to kill Jews, to think that it's a noble thing to go on jihad and kill Jews. And then it erupts into violence, the Israelis retaliate. Mark Lamont Hill is pretending as if these retaliations are gratuitous, out of the blue, and are in response to nothing. Anybody who's been following what really happens there knows that's not true.
Now, to push back a little bit, I would say that it does appear to seem that Israel is not necessarily innocent all the time as well. In the sense of this is, when I look at this situation, I realize that there's a lot of tension going on. So like when a drastic a catastrophic attack of some sort happens, then the other side will respond with another attack. And then hostility between each side continues to grow as the conflict, kind of continues to ensue. And so with that, I mean, if we kind of look at what's going on right now, so there's no doubt Hamas has committed, obviously some war crimes. But would you say that Israel's response in bombing Gaza and the marketplace and, apartment buildings and that sort of thing, if that is true, would that also be considered a war crime as well?
No, it isn't, John, and I'll tell you why. The Palestinians, actually, even the UN, which is deeply anti-Israel, has recognized that Hamas uses civilian areas to mount attacks. And then it's deliberately trying to exploit any retaliatory fire for propaganda purposes. So it puts the rocket launcher in a schoolyard, shoots the rockets into Israel. Then Israel zeroes in on the rocket launcher and bombs it. And then the Palestinians go to the international press and say, look, they bombed our school.
Right.
And the press reports it uncritically. All the time, if you look at the coverage of the establishment media, you see Israel kills 5 Palestinians. And it doesn't tell you until paragraph 32 that those guys were jihadis who were firing guns at Israeli civilians or something. And it's presented as if it were this out of the blue gratuitous attack. So it's no wonder Mark Lamont Hill would think this is what's going on in Israel. This is how it's reported. but the reporting is consistently inaccurate. The Palestinians also have a very sophisticated propaganda machine. And I've been tracking this for many years. You can find a lot of exploration of this in my book, The Palestinian Delusion. But what you find is, for example, there will be a picture of a little girl, pretty cute little girl, and some Palestinian journalist will put it up on Twitter and say, this is so-and-so who is 2 years old and was killed in an Israeli bombing last Thursday. And then all the comments are expressions of sympathy and outrage toward the Israelis. And then you find out a week later that the same picture was used in Iraq in 2018, and it's an Iraqi girl who has nothing to do with Israel or the Palestinians. And her picture was taken and misrepresented deliberately by these Palestinian journalists in order to smear Israel. There was an American girl, as a matter of fact, who was used that way a few years ago, and the mom finds pictures of her on Twitter saying she's been killed, and she was actually alive and well in Minnesota or someplace, and had no idea, but they'd gone into Facebook and found her picture at random and started using it in propaganda.
Yeah, gotcha. Now, what would you say to those who consider it to be somewhat of a war crime for Israel to shut off all electricity, food, and water to Gaza? Now, granted that I would say that Israel, obviously, if they're the ones giving it to them, then they have the right to take it away in that sense. But I can't help but feel sorry for all of the Palestinians that may not be on board with what Hamas is doing in the Gaza region. So what would you say when it comes to those? Because I'm worried that there's going to be a lot more people, a lot more casualties as this continues to go. And I believe that obviously it's Hamas's fault to some extent for bringing all these people into Gaza in the first place and then holding them as hostage as well, and hiding their military behind civilians. But what can we do, or what are your kind of thoughts on that situation when it comes to how we could resolve this? Is there any way to do it in another way, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. In the first place, we're not talking about a people that is innocent and oppressed by its government. I mean, obviously there's some,
Right.
but 75% of the people in Gaza voted for Hamas.
Right.
And just recently, there was a poll that showed that 75% of the Gazans still support Hamas. It was before all this started, but nonetheless, it's pretty clear that they love most of the people there. Obviously not all, but most of the people there love what's happening. Now, should the electricity and water be cut off? I think the first thing to ask about that is, did you know, and I ask the people watching this, how many of you knew that Israel was supplying free electricity and water to Gaza while Gaza is scheming to kill Israelis? How many people would say that a country that is supplying essential needs to another group that is a mortal enemy and wants it dead, that country's the oppressor? Obviously, the Israelis have been more than generous in this, and they only started to withhold some of this when the Palestinians refused to end their pay-for-slave program. The Palestinian Authority pays money to the terrorists who are in prison and to the families of terrorists who are killed. These are people who are murderers, who killed Israeli civilians, and the Palestinian Authority pays money to them or to their families. And so Israel started withholding from tax money that it actually was giving to the Palestinians, withholding the amount they were paying to the terrorists. But the free electricity and water just kept flowing. And so now they're saying that they're going to cut it off, and everybody's all upset. And I think, how many of you knew it was even happening? And what about all this Arab solidarity with all the Arab Muslim countries supporting the Palestinians? Well, let them come in let the Egyptians open that southern border and come in with electricity and water. But why should Israel be supplying it when the Gazans are almost wholly dedicated to the mass murder of Israelis?
Okay, and yeah, and we're getting kind of short on time here, so let's go ahead and watch the last clip, and then we'll come back to talk about that clip as well.
So as we examine the recent wave of violence, we must understand that this is the context that created the awful violence that we've just seen. we must also use this context and allow it to inform our next steps. To achieve a lasting peace, we cannot give a blank check to Israelis' right-wing governments. We cannot give them license to wipe out and destroy Palestinians without a moment's notice. We cannot allow or sanction the elimination of electricity and fuel and food to the Gaza Strip, which is a violation of international law as a form of collective punishment. We cannot continue to trap Gazans in an open-air prison. We cannot undermine the conditions for fair and free elections so that Fatah and Hamas can no longer rule without a democratic mandate. We all want peace, but justice is the necessary precondition for peace. And that will only come by ending the Israeli occupation, by dismantling the apartheid state, and by creating the conditions for freedom, safety, dignity, and determination for every Muslim, every Christian, every Jew, every Israeli, every Palestinian, every single person in the region.
That apartheid state business, John, is just a vicious slander. It's very common on the left for people to say that, but apartheid comes from South Africa. In South Africa, there was racial discrimination by the white minority against the black majority, and it was a system in which there were separate institutions, and the white ones were nice and the black ones were shoddy, and it was a systematized oppression, and that was apartheid. There is no apartheid in Israel. There are Israeli Arabs who are Muslims at every level of Israeli society. They have full equality of rights. The president of Bank Leumi, the largest bank in Israel, is an Arab. There are Arabs who are serving in the Knesset, the parliament of Israel. There were no black South Africans in the apartheid parliament. And the idea of Israeli apartheid just comes from what I was discussing before about the checkpoints and the searches for Palestinian Arabs wanting to come into Israel, which is just a matter of national security. The black South Africans who were suffering under real apartheid were not saying, we're going to blow up the white South Africans, we're going to kill them all, we're going to take over the place. Certainly, actually, there were some revolutionaries, but for the most part, you're talking about peaceful, innocent people. And in Israel, you do not have that. In Israel, you have these people who have been, you look at the Middle East Media Research Institute or Palestinian Media Watch, and you see again and again in the Palestinian media, there's incitement to hatred, to violence, and to genocide. And that is the reason why there is any suffering in the Palestinian areas. If they would, as the old adage goes, if the Palestinians laid down their arms, there would be peace. If the Israelis laid down their arms, there would be genocide.
All right. And last question before you go. Thank you for joining us. And where can people find more of your work and also this book that you've written on this subject?
Yeah, I'm at jihadwatch.org, and we're covering the jihad against Israel and the jihad against everybody else. Been there 20 years. It's at jihadwatch.org. And David Wood and I do a video every Wednesday night, or most Wednesday nights, This Week in Jihad, where we summarize some of the main events of the week. I've written 27 books, mostly on this aspects of the jihad, including the Palestinian delusion, the catastrophic history of the Middle East peace process. You can find those at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any self-respecting bookstore.
All right, Robert, good to see you again, man, and we'll talk soon. Now, if you're interested in following this story, make sure you subscribe because we'll be covering it with more special guests as the story continues to develop. In the meantime, check out this playlist with the other videos that we've done talking about the Israel and Palestine conflict, and I'll see you soon.